The fluorescent lights of the corporate building's basement flickered as Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway, the wheels squeaking against the polished floor. It was 3:15 in the morning, and the silence was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional drip from a leaky pipe. Marcus had been working as a janitor in this building for the past 8 months, invisible to the executives who rushed past him during the day, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floors he scrubbed every night. But that invisibility was exactly what he wanted, because Marcus Thompson wasn't just a janitor. He was Richard Hayes, the 52-year-old billionaire CEO of Hayes Industries, and he was conducting the most important investigation of his career from behind a mop and bucket. The decision to go undercover had come after Marcus discovered something that kept him awake at night. His company, the empire he had built from nothing over 25 years, was bleeding from the inside. Profits were declining, employee turnover was at an all-time high, and anonymous complaints about toxic management had flooded the HR department. But whenever Marcus called management meetings or reviewed reports, everything looked perfect on paper. The numbers added up, the presentations were polished, and his executives smiled and nodded in all the right places. He realized then that he was too far removed from the truth, insulated in his corner office on the 40th floor, surrounded by people who told him only what he wanted to hear. So Marcus made a decision that his board of directors would have called insane. He created a fake identity, hired an actor to play the CEO in public appearances, and descended into his own company as Marcus Thompson, a 52-year-old janitor who needed the night shift because of financial troubles. The transformation had been remarkably simple. Marcus grew out his graying beard, bought clothes from thrift stores, and adopted the tired posture of a man who had worked manual labor his entire life. He rented a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood and drove a beat-up 2008 Honda Civic that he bought for $800 cash. During the day, he slept and planned. At night, he cleaned offices, emptied trash cans, and most importantly, he watched and listened. He heard the conversations that people had when they thought no one important was around. He saw the emails left open on computer screens, the documents carelessly thrown in trash bins, and the true dynamics between managers and their teams. And what he discovered made his blood run cold. Derek Walsh was exactly the kind of manager that was destroying Hayes Industries from within. At 38 years old, Derek had risen quickly through the ranks, not through competence or leadership, but through political maneuvering and taking credit for other people's work. He was handsome in that generic corporate way, with perfectly styled hair, expensive suits, and a smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes. Derek ruled his department through fear and humiliation, and he had a particular talent for making people feel small. Marcus had watched him berate assistants for minor mistakes, steal ideas from junior employees and present them as his own, and create an atmosphere of such toxic competition that good people were quitting every month. But Derek was careful. He was charming to his superiors, always had plausible deniability, and knew exactly how to play the corporate game. Marcus had endured 8 months of Derek's abuse. He had been called stupid, lazy, and worthless. Derek had made jokes about Marcus's worn-out work boots, his cheap lunch, and his age. He had deliberately knocked over freshly mopped floors and laughed when Marcus had to clean them again. Every insult, every humiliation, Marcus had absorbed in silence, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the mop handle. He told himself it was necessary, that he needed to see the full extent of the rot before he could cut it out. But there were nights when he sat in his janitor's closet, surrounded by cleaning supplies and the smell of industrial soap, and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Then came the morning that would change everything. Marcus had finished his shift and decided to take a short break in the supply closet on the 3rd floor before heading home. The night had been particularly exhausting, and he had closed his eyes for what he thought would be just 10 minutes. But exhaustion had pulled him under, and when he woke up, it was 7:30 in the morning, and the building was full of employees starting their day. Marcus quickly gathered his things and headed for the exit, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But as he turned the corner near the elevators, he came face to face with Derek Walsh, who was arriving early and holding his morning coffee. Derek's eyes widened, then narrowed with malicious pleasure as he realized what he was seeing. Marcus knew exactly what was about to happen, and for the first time in 8 months, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Derek's voice cut through the morning air like a knife, loud enough that several employees emerging from the elevators turned to look. He accused Marcus of stealing company time, of being a lazy fraud who was sleeping on the job while honest people worked. The words came fast and sharp, designed to humiliate and destroy. Derek announced that Marcus was fired, effective immediately, and that security would escort him from the building. He said these things with a smile on his face, enjoying every second of the power he wielded over someone he considered beneath him. Marcus stood there in his janitor's uniform, his head slightly bowed, and said nothing. He simply nodded slowly, picked up his cleaning cart, and began walking toward the service elevator. The gathered employees watched with a mixture of pity and discomfort, then quickly dispersed, not wanting to be associated with the scene. Derek watched Marcus's retreating figure with satisfaction, already composing the email he would send to HR about terminating an unreliable employee. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Marcus had been waiting for this exact moment. For 8 months, Marcus had documented everything. He had recordings of Derek's abusive tirades, saved emails that proved he was stealing credit and sabotaging colleagues, and testimonies from 17 employees who had agreed to speak once they learned the truth. Marcus had built an airtight case against Derek and 3 other toxic managers who were poisoning the company culture. But he needed one more piece of evidence, something that would make the exposure undeniable and public. He needed Derek to reveal his true character in a way that couldn't be explained away or smoothed over by corporate diplomacy. And Derek, in his arrogance and cruelty, had just handed Marcus exactly what he needed, by firing him in front of witnesses for something as petty as taking a break. Marcus took the service elevator down to the basement, stored his cleaning supplies in the janitor's closet for the last time, and walked out through the loading dock. He made his way to the parking garage, but instead of heading to the employee section where his beat-up Honda Civic sat, he walked to the executive level. There, in the spot marked "Reserved for CEO," sat his midnight blue Mercedes S-Class, the one with custom leather interior and the personalized license plate that read Hayes 1. Marcus had parked it there at 5 that morning, knowing that Derek always arrived early and always parked near the executive spaces to feel important. He had calculated the timing perfectly. Derek would exit through the main lobby, walk past the executive parking area and see the car. And when he saw the car in the CEO's spot, he would be curious. When he saw the license plate, he would be confused. And when he ran the plate and realized it belonged to Marcus Thompson, the janitor he had just fired, his world would begin to crumble. Marcus climbed into his Mercedes, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, feeling the leather seat beneath him and the steering wheel in his hands. For 8 months he had lived a lie, endured humiliation, and worked in the shadows. But now it was time to step back into the light, not as Marcus Thompson the janitor, but as Richard Hayes, the CEO who had just completed the most comprehensive undercover investigation in corporate history. He checked his watch. It was 7:53 in the morning. In 7 minutes, Derek would walk past this parking spot. In 10 minutes, Derek would realize what he had done. And by noon, everyone in Hayes Industries would know the truth. Marcus adjusted his rearview mirror and saw his own reflection staring back at him. The beard was still there, the tired lines around his eyes, but behind them was something Derek had never seen because he had never bothered to look. It was the intelligence of a man who had built an empire, the patience of someone who played the long game, and the cold satisfaction of a chess player who had just set up checkmate. Marcus smiled, put the car in reverse and slowly, deliberately backed out of the CEO's parking space. He drove to the exit ramp that led past the main entrance, knowing that Derek would see him. And as he approached the glass doors of the lobby, he saw Derek standing there, frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his lips and his face pale with the dawning realization of what he was seeing. Marcus didn't speed up or slow down. He simply drove past at exactly the speed limit, made eye contact with Derek through the window, and gave him the same slow, respectful nod that a janitor gives to his superior. Then he drove away, leaving Derek standing there with his world collapsing around him. Derek Walsh stood in the lobby like a statue, his brain struggling to process what his eyes had just witnessed. The janitor he had fired 20 minutes ago, the man he had humiliated in front of a dozen employees, had just driven past him in a car that cost more than Derek made in 3 years. And not just any parking spot, but the CEO's reserved space. Derek's hands began to tremble slightly, the coffee cup shaking as a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. He pulled out his phone and opened the company directory, scrolling frantically to the executive section. There was a photo of Richard Hayes, the CEO, but it was always the same official corporate headshot, taken years ago, showing a clean-shaven man in an expensive suit. Derek had never actually met the CEO in person. Hayes was known for being reclusive, rarely appearing at company events, always sending his VP of operations to handle public appearances. Derek had assumed the man was simply too important, too busy running a billion-dollar empire to interact with middle management. Now, as he stared at that corporate photo and mentally added a beard, some weight, and 8 months of exhaustion, his stomach dropped. He ran to the parking garage, his expensive shoes slapping against the concrete as he sprinted to the executive level. The CEO's parking space was empty now, but Derek stood there staring at it, breathing hard, his mind racing through every interaction he had ever had with Marcus Thompson. Every insult, every humiliation, every cruel joke came flooding back with horrifying clarity. He had called the CEO stupid. He had mocked the CEO's clothes. He had made the CEO clean up messes on purpose, and just this morning, he had fired the CEO in front of witnesses for taking a break. Derek felt his legs go weak, and he had to lean against a concrete pillar to steady himself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of mistake, some bizarre coincidence. Maybe Marcus had stolen the car, maybe he was related to someone important. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't end with Derek's career being completely destroyed. But even as Derek tried to convince himself, he knew the truth. All the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Hayes Industries had been conducting some kind of internal review for months. There had been quiet audits, unexpected HR interviews, and rumors of major changes coming. Derek had assumed it was standard corporate house cleaning, nothing that would affect him. He had always been careful, always covered his tracks, always maintained his image as a successful manager. But if Marcus was actually Richard Hayes, if the CEO had spent 8 months working undercover as a janitor in his own company, then Hayes hadn't been conducting a standard review. He had been conducting an investigation. And Derek, in his arrogance and cruelty, had given Hayes a front-row seat to every terrible thing he had ever done. Derek pulled out his phone again with shaking hands and called his assistant. He told her to cancel all his meetings for the day, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Then he called his lawyer, his personal attorney who handled his contracts and investments. The lawyer answered on the 3rd ring, sounding sleepy and annoyed at being called before 8 in the morning. Derek tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a confused rush about janitors and CEOs and parking spaces. The lawyer listened in silence, then asked a single question that made Derek's blood run cold. He asked if Derek had any documentation of his treatment of this janitor, any witnesses to their interactions, any written record of the firing. Derek closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cool concrete pillar. Documentation. There was security camera footage throughout the building. There were the dozen employees who had watched him fire Marcus this morning. There were probably hundreds of witnesses to 8 months of abuse. The lawyer's next words were careful and measured. He told Derek not to speak to anyone, not to send any emails, not to make any statements until they could meet and discuss the situation properly. He said that if this janitor was actually the CEO, if Derek had indeed been abusing and then firing his own boss, then Derek needed to prepare for the possibility of serious consequences. The word lawsuit hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Derek ended the call and stood alone in the parking garage, surrounded by expensive cars that belonged to executives who would soon know exactly what he had done. The morning sun streamed through the open sides of the structure, bright and cheerful, completely at odds with the disaster unfolding around him. Derek had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, carefully constructing his image as a successful manager, and in one morning, in the space of 20 minutes, he had destroyed it all. And the worst part was that he had done it to himself, one cruel word at a time, watched by the one person in the entire company who had the power to end his career with a single decision. Marcus drove to his real home, a penthouse apartment in the city's most exclusive district, and stood under the shower for 30 minutes, washing away 8 months of industrial soap and floor cleaner. He watched the water circle the drain and felt the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. The beard would stay for now, a reminder of what he had learned and who he had become during those months in the basement. He dressed in one of his tailored suits, the fabric feeling almost foreign against his skin after so long in the janitor's uniform, and sat down at his home office with a cup of coffee. The view from his window showed the entire city skyline, including the Hayes Industries building where Derek Walsh was probably still standing in the parking garage, trying to understand how his world had just imploded. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, then opened his laptop and began the next phase of his plan. The evidence he had collected over 8 months was staggering in its completeness. Marcus had recordings of Derek berating employees, calling them worthless and stupid, threatening their jobs over minor mistakes. He had emails that Derek had carelessly thrown away, printed copies showing how he had sabotaged a colleague's project presentation by sending the wrong files to the client, then taken credit when the colleague had to work all night to fix the disaster. There were testimony statements from 17 current and former employees, all carefully documented and legally verified, describing a pattern of harassment, theft of intellectual property, and deliberate creation of a hostile work environment. Marcus had surveillance footage from the building's cameras showing Derek's behavior, and he had his own recordings from a device he had worn hidden in his janitor's uniform. Everything was organized, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. It wasn't just evidence, it was a prosecution case ready for trial. But Marcus wasn't interested in a quiet termination or a confidential settlement. Derek Walsh represented everything that was wrong with corporate culture, the disease that had infected Hayes Industries and countless other companies. He was the manager who prioritized his own advancement over his team's well-being, who saw employees as disposable resources rather than human beings, who created fear instead of inspiration. And Derek wasn't alone. Marcus's investigation had identified 3 other managers with similar patterns of behavior, a network of toxic leadership that had driven away talented people and poisoned the company culture from within. Marcus had spent 25 years building Hayes Industries into a company he was proud of, and these men had nearly destroyed it in less than 5 years. They needed to be removed, but more importantly, their removal needed to send a message that would echo through every department and every office. The message was simple: this kind of behavior would not be tolerated, not hidden, not excused, and not rewarded. Marcus composed an email to his executive board, his real executive board, the 7 people who knew about his undercover operation and had been receiving weekly updates. He informed them that the investigation was complete and that he would be returning to his position as CEO the following Monday. He requested an emergency, all-hands meeting for that morning at 10 o'clock, where he would be addressing the entire company. The board members responded within minutes, their emails a mixture of relief and anticipation. They had supported his decision to go undercover, despite their concerns about the risk and the unorthodox nature of the plan. Now they wanted to know what he had discovered and what changes he intended to make. Marcus replied that he would brief them privately on Sunday evening before the Monday announcement, and that they should prepare for significant restructuring in the management team. The next step was more delicate. Marcus called his head of human resources, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had been with the company for 12 years and who had also been aware of his undercover mission. Sarah answered immediately, her voice tense with anticipation. Marcus told her that the operation was complete and that he needed her to prepare termination packages for 4 managers, including Derek Walsh. But these wouldn't be standard terminations with severance packages and letters of recommendation. These would be terminations for cause, with full documentation of the reasons, no severance beyond what was legally required, and most importantly, no confidentiality agreements. Marcus wanted the truth to be public. He wanted every employee to understand exactly why these managers were being removed and what standards of behavior would be expected going forward. Sarah listened carefully, asked clarifying questions about the legal documentation, and agreed to have everything prepared by Sunday evening. She mentioned that she had been receiving complaints about Derek Walsh for years, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared or been dismissed by his superiors. Finally, she said, someone was listening. The weekend passed in careful preparation. Marcus met with his legal team on Saturday morning, reviewing every piece of evidence to ensure it would withstand scrutiny. His lawyers, initially shocked by the extent of his undercover operation, quickly recognized the thoroughness of his documentation. They confirmed that the terminations for cause were legally sound and that the company had more than sufficient grounds to dismiss Derek Walsh and the 3 other managers without severance. More importantly, they advised that the evidence showed a pattern of behavior that had likely cost the company millions in lost productivity, employee turnover, and potential lawsuits. One lawyer pointed out that Marcus himself could theoretically file a harassment claim against Derek for the treatment he had endured as a janitor, though Marcus dismissed the idea immediately. This wasn't about personal grievance. It was about fixing his company and ensuring that good people could work without fear. Sunday evening arrived, and Marcus sat in the boardroom with his 7 board members, presenting the findings of his 8-month investigation. He showed them the videos, played the recordings, and walked them through the documented evidence of systematic abuse and misconduct. The boardroom fell silent as they watched footage of Derek berating a young assistant until she was visibly shaking, then laughing about it with another manager. They saw emails where managers discussed deliberately overworking certain employees to force them to quit, saving the company the cost of severance packages. They heard recordings of confidential employee information being mocked and shared inappropriately. By the time Marcus finished his presentation, 2 of the board members were visibly angry. One was pale with shock, and all of them understood the gravity of what had been happening beneath their noses. The board voted unanimously to support Marcus's proposed actions. The 4 managers would be terminated Monday morning before the all-hands meeting. Security would escort them from the building immediately, and their access to company systems would be revoked simultaneously to prevent any sabotage or data theft. The all-hands meeting would then proceed, where Marcus would reveal his identity as the undercover janitor and explain exactly what he had discovered and why the terminations had occurred. The board members expressed concern about the potential fallout, the shock it would cause among employees, and the risk to company morale. But Marcus countered that the current situation was already destroying morale, that good employees were leaving in droves, and that the only way to rebuild trust was through radical transparency. The company needed to see that leadership was willing to take dramatic action to protect its people, even if that action was uncomfortable and unprecedented. Marcus spent Sunday night in his office rehearsing the speech he would give Monday morning. The words needed to be precise, honest, and clear. He would not hide behind corporate language or soften the truth. He would tell them that he had failed as a CEO by becoming too isolated, too removed from the daily reality of his employees' lives. He would tell them that he had gone undercover not to spy or entrap, but to understand the truth that wasn't reaching his office. He would tell them what he had discovered, show them the evidence, and explain the actions being taken. Most importantly, he would tell them that Hayes Industries was going to change, that the culture of fear and abuse was ending today, and that going forward, leadership would be measured not by profits alone, but by how they treated the people who made those profits possible. As midnight approached, Marcus stood at his office window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Derek Walsh was probably lying awake, consumed by anxiety about what Monday would bring. The other 3 managers likely suspected nothing, confident in their positions and their carefully constructed images. By this time tomorrow, all 4 would be gone, their careers in ruins, their reputations destroyed. Marcus felt no guilt about this. He had given them every opportunity to reveal their true character, and they had shown him exactly who they were. Now they would face the consequences of their choices, not through secret backroom deals or quiet resignations, but through public accountability. The old Marcus, the CEO who had ruled from the 40th floor, might have handled this differently, might have chosen discretion and damage control. But 8 months as an invisible janitor had changed him. He had cleaned floors beside people who were struggling, who were being crushed by bad management, who deserved better. And he would not fail them again. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that promised change. Marcus arrived at Hayes Industries at 6:30, entering through the executive entrance for the first time in 8 months. The security guard on duty, a man named Robert who had always treated Marcus kindly during his time as a janitor, did a double take when he saw him in a suit. Marcus stopped and shook Robert's hand, thanking him for his consistent professionalism and respect. Robert stammered something about not recognizing him, about not knowing who he really was. But Marcus simply smiled and said that Robert had treated a janitor with the same dignity he now showed as CEO, and that said everything about Robert's character. The guard's eyes widened as understanding dawned, and Marcus left him standing there, processing the implications of what he had just learned. The executive floor was quiet at this early hour. Marcus went directly to his office, the corner suite that he hadn't seen in 8 months. His assistant, Jennifer, who had been managing his schedule and correspondence while believing she was working for the stand-in CEO, arrived at 7 and nearly dropped her coffee when she saw him sitting at his desk. Marcus spent 30 minutes bringing her up to speed, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock to something like awe as he explained the undercover operation. Jennifer had been fielding complaints and concerns for months, trying to protect employees while maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. Now she understood why the CEO had seemed distant and disconnected during that time. It was because he hadn't been there at all. He had been 3 floors below them, pushing a mop and watching everything fall apart. At 8 o'clock, Sarah Chen from Human Resources arrived with security personnel and the termination paperwork. The 4 managers were called into separate conference rooms simultaneously, a coordinated operation designed to prevent any of them from warning the others or causing a scene. Derek Walsh was brought in first, escorted by 2 security officers. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his suit wrinkled. When he saw Marcus sitting at the conference table, clean-shaven in the corporate photo, but now with the beard Derek knew so well, the last bit of color drained from his face. Sarah Chen read the termination letter aloud, citing specific instances of harassment, abuse of power, creation of a hostile work environment, and violation of company ethics policies. Each charge was backed by documented evidence, time-stamped and verified. Derek's employment was terminated effective immediately for cause, with no severance beyond his final paycheck and accrued vacation time. Derek tried to speak, his voice cracking as he attempted to apologize or explain or somehow undo what had been done. But Marcus raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. Marcus told Derek that he had had 8 months to show his true character, and he had shown it repeatedly, consistently, and proudly. He had humiliated people who were working hard and doing their best. He had stolen credit and destroyed careers. He had created an environment where good employees were afraid to come to work. And when given the opportunity to show basic human decency to a tired janitor who had fallen asleep during a break, Derek had instead chosen public humiliation and termination. Marcus told Derek that he was not sorry this was happening, that Derek had earned every consequence he was now facing, and that the only regret Marcus had was not discovering the truth sooner and protecting his employees from Derek's abuse years ago. Security escorted Derek from the building within 15 minutes. His personal items would be boxed and mailed to him. His computer access was already revoked, his company credit cards cancelled, his parking pass deactivated. He walked through the lobby in a daze, past employees who were arriving for work and who watched with confusion as their manager was led out by security. The same scene was playing out simultaneously with the 3 other managers, each in different conference rooms, each receiving the same message. Their behavior had been documented, their employment was terminated, and they would not be given the opportunity to resign quietly or negotiate a better exit. By 8:45, all 4 were gone, and the building buzzed with rumors and speculation. Employees gathered in clusters, whispering about what they had seen, trying to understand what was happening. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and everyone in the company had received the mandatory attendance notice. Something big was coming, and the entire organization could feel it. The auditorium on the second floor filled quickly as employees streamed in, their conversations creating a low buzz of nervous energy. The room could hold 400 people, and every seat was taken, with more employees standing along the walls and in the aisles. People from every department were present, from entry-level assistants to senior vice presidents, all summoned by the mysterious mandatory meeting notice. The stage at the front was empty, except for a podium and a large screen, and the lights were dimmed slightly, adding to the sense of anticipation. Employees checked their phones, reading the morning's rumors about the 4 managers being escorted out by security. Some speculated about layoffs, others whispered about a merger or acquisition, and a few quietly hoped that someone had finally noticed the toxic culture that had been poisoning their workplace for years. At exactly 10 o'clock, the lights dimmed further, and Marcus walked onto the stage. The reaction was immediate and confused. Those who had worked closely with the executive team recognized him from corporate photos, but the beard threw them off. Others had never seen the CEO in person and weren't sure who this man was. But the room fell silent as Marcus stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. He began by thanking them for coming, his voice calm and measured, amplified through the auditorium's sound system. Then he said something that made every person in that room lean forward in their seats. He told them that for the past 8 months, he had not been working as their CEO. He had been working as Marcus Thompson, a night shift janitor on the cleaning crew, and he had spent those 8 months learning the truth about what was really happening in his company. The silence that followed was absolute. 400 people sat frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Then the murmuring began, a wave of shock and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Marcus raised his hand, and the room quieted again. He explained that Hayes Industries had been struggling with declining morale, increasing turnover, and persistent complaints about management that never seemed to be resolved. He told them that he had realized he was too isolated in his executive office, too far removed from the daily reality of his employees' lives, and that reports and metrics couldn't tell him what he needed to know. So he had made the decision to go undercover, to work alongside them, to see and hear and experience what they experienced every day. And what he had discovered had both broken his heart and filled him with determination to make things right. Marcus then displayed the first slide on the screen behind him. It showed a simple organizational chart of the 4 managers who had been terminated that morning. He told the audience that these 4 individuals had been removed from the company effective immediately, terminated for cause with full documentation of their misconduct. The room erupted in whispers again, some of shock, some of satisfaction, some of vindication. Marcus continued, explaining that he would be showing them evidence of why these terminations had occurred, not to humiliate the terminated employees further, but because transparency was the only way to rebuild trust. He said that for too long, bad behavior had been hidden, explained away or ignored, and that this lack of accountability had allowed a toxic culture to flourish. That ended today. The next 30 minutes were difficult to watch. Marcus played edited video clips showing Derek Walsh verbally abusing employees, calling them incompetent and worthless over minor mistakes. He showed emails where managers discussed deliberately sabotaging projects to make rivals look bad. He displayed testimony from employees who had quit because of harassment, their written statements describing hostile work environments and fear of retaliation. Each piece of evidence was carefully chosen to illustrate not just individual bad acts, but a pattern of systematic abuse of power. Marcus watched the faces in the audience as they viewed the evidence. Some looked angry, some looked vindicated, and some looked devastated that this had been happening while they worked just down the hall, unaware. When the presentation ended, the room sat in stunned silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, someone began to clap. Another person joined, then another, and within seconds the entire room was applauding, some people standing, some with tears running down their faces. They were applauding not just the terminations, but the acknowledgement of what they had endured, the validation of their experiences and the promise of real change. Marcus waited for the applause to fade before continuing, and when he spoke again, His voice carried a weight of personal responsibility that silenced the room completely. He told them that while he was grateful for their response, he needed them to understand that this situation was partly his fault. He had allowed himself to become disconnected from his own company, isolated in meetings and reports, while the people who made Hayes Industries function suffered beneath him. He had built systems that allowed bad managers to hide their behavior, that prioritized metrics over humanity, that made it difficult for employees to report problems without fear of retaliation. The fact that he'd had to go undercover in his own company to learn the truth was itself an indictment of the culture he had allowed to develop. Marcus told them that the 4 terminations were just the beginning, that there would be a complete restructuring of how management was evaluated and held accountable, and that going forward, leadership would be measured not just by department performance, but by employee satisfaction, retention, and well-being. He then shared something that made the room go quiet again. Marcus described his 8 months as a janitor in detail, the night shifts cleaning offices and restrooms, the exhaustion, the invisibility. He told them about being called stupid and lazy, about having Derek Walsh deliberately knock over freshly mopped floors and laugh while Marcus cleaned them again. He described the morning he was fired, the public humiliation in front of a dozen witnesses, all because he had fallen asleep during a break after working through the night. Marcus's voice remained steady as he recounted these experiences, but there was an emotion beneath the words that resonated through the auditorium. He told them that he now understood what it felt like to be treated as less than human, to be invisible, to have your dignity stripped away by someone who saw you as beneath their consideration. And he promised them that he would never forget those lessons, that they had fundamentally changed how he viewed leadership and what kind of company he wanted Hayes Industries to be. The screen behind Marcus changed to show a new slide, this one outlining immediate changes being implemented. First, a new anonymous reporting system was being launched, one that went directly to an independent third-party ethics committee rather than through the chain of command. Second, all managers from supervisor level up would undergo mandatory training on ethical leadership and would be evaluated quarterly, not just on department metrics, but on confidential employee feedback. Third, exit interviews would now be conducted by external consultants to ensure honest feedback without fear of burning bridges. Fourth, and most significantly, 20% of every manager's annual bonus would now be tied directly to their team's satisfaction scores and retention rates. Marcus explained that these changes were designed to ensure that what had happened under Derek Walsh and the others could never happen again, that employees would have real power to hold their leaders accountable, and that being a manager at Hayes Industries would mean being a servant leader, not a tyrant. Marcus then addressed the elephant in the room that many were surely wondering about. He acknowledged that some people might feel uncomfortable knowing that their CEO had been watching them undercover, that there might be concerns about privacy and trust. He understood those concerns and wanted to be absolutely clear. The undercover operation was over. It would never happen again, and it had been focused exclusively on management behavior, not on rank-and-file employees. Every recording, every piece of evidence he had gathered was related to documenting management misconduct. He had not been investigating employees, monitoring their productivity, or looking for reasons to terminate people. In fact, what he had learned from working alongside the cleaning crew and interacting with employees after hours was that Hayes Industries had incredible talent, dedicated people who cared deeply about their work, despite the obstacles placed in their way by bad management. The problem had never been the employees. It had been the leadership that was supposed to support them. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes as Marcus outlined his vision for the company's future. He talked about creating a culture of psychological safety where people could speak up without fear, where mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than career death sentences, where innovation was encouraged rather than punished. He announced the formation of an employee advisory council that would meet monthly with the executive team to raise concerns and suggest improvements. He revealed that the company would be conducting a comprehensive culture audit with an outside consulting firm, and that the results would be shared transparently with all employees. Marcus told them that rebuilding trust would take time, that actions would matter more than words, and that he expected them to hold him and the entire leadership team accountable to these commitments. He ended by saying that Hayes Industries had lost its way, but together they were going to find it again. And this time they would build something stronger, something better, something that honored the people who made it all possible. The weeks following the all-hands meeting brought a transformation that rippled through every level of Hayes Industries. The story of Marcus's undercover operation spread beyond the company walls, picked up first by local business publications and then by national media. Headlines proclaimed variations of CEO goes undercover as janitor to root out toxic management, and billionaire spends 8 months mopping floors in his own company. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, with business analysts praising Marcus's unconventional approach and calling it a masterclass in ethical leadership. Other CEOs reached out asking for advice on implementing similar transparency measures in their own organizations. But Marcus remained focused on the internal work, knowing that media attention was fleeting, but cultural change required sustained effort and genuine commitment. The impact on company morale was immediate and profound. Employees who had been quietly suffering under toxic management began to speak up, using the new anonymous reporting system to share their experiences and concerns. The Ethics Committee received over 200 reports in the first month, ranging from minor grievances to serious allegations of misconduct. Each report was investigated thoroughly, and 3 additional managers were placed on performance improvement plans with strict oversight. 2 chose to resign rather than face the scrutiny. But the reporting system also revealed positive stories: employees nominating managers who had protected their teams, mentored junior staff and created healthy work environments despite pressure from above. These managers were publicly recognized and received bonuses, sending a clear message about what kind of leadership the company valued. The transformation wasn't just about removing bad actors, it was about celebrating and empowering good ones. Derek Walsh's fate became a cautionary tale that spread through professional networks across the city. Without the protection of his position or the ability to control the narrative, the full extent of his misconduct became public knowledge. Former employees who had left the company specifically because of him came forward with their own stories, corroborating everything Marcus had documented. Derek found himself unemployable in his field, his reputation destroyed not by Marcus's revenge, but by the weight of his own actions finally catching up with him. He filed a wrongful termination lawsuit that was dismissed within 3 months, the judge ruling that Hayes Industries had more than sufficient documented cause for the termination. The other 3 terminated managers faced similar consequences, their careers effectively ended by their own choices. Marcus felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet sense that justice had been served and that future employees would be protected from similar abuse. The culture audit conducted by the external consulting firm revealed deeper problems than even Marcus had suspected. The toxic management style he had witnessed wasn't limited to Derek Walsh and his peers. It was a symptom of systemic issues in how the company had structured advancement and rewards. High performers were promoted into management positions without any leadership training or support. Then evaluated solely on metrics like productivity and profit margins, with no consideration for how they achieved those numbers. This created an environment where abusive behavior was not just tolerated, but inadvertently rewarded, as long as the department's numbers looked good. Marcus implemented a complete overhaul of the promotion and evaluation system, requiring all potential managers to complete a comprehensive leadership development program before assuming any supervisory role. He also created a new position, Chief People Officer, with authority equal to other C-suite executives, and a mandate to prioritize employee well-being alongside business performance. 6 months after the all-hands meeting, Hayes Industries held its quarterly company gathering, and the difference was palpable. Employees who had once sat silently now asked questions and offered suggestions. Department heads presented not just their financial results, but their team satisfaction scores and retention rates, discussing both with equal seriousness. The Employee Advisory Council, made up of representatives from every level and department, had already implemented 12 significant policy changes based on staff feedback. Employee turnover had dropped by 62%, and the company had received over 3,000 applications for 50 open positions, a dramatic increase from the recruitment struggles of the previous year. Customer satisfaction scores had also risen, as happier employees provided better service and showed more genuine engagement with their work. The financial metrics that the board cared about were improving too, proving what Marcus had believed all along, that treating people well wasn't just morally right, it was good business. 1 year after his return as CEO, Marcus stood in the same auditorium where he had revealed his undercover operation, but this time the atmosphere was celebratory rather than tense. Hayes Industries was holding its annual employee appreciation event, and the room was filled with laughter and conversation rather than nervous whispers. Marcus watched from backstage as employees mingled, many of them people he had worked alongside during his months as a janitor. He saw Maria from the night cleaning crew, who was now enrolled in the company's tuition reimbursement program, studying business administration. He saw James, a junior analyst who had been afraid to speak up under Derek Walsh's management, and who had just been promoted to team lead after proposing an innovative solution that saved the company $2 million annually. The transformation wasn't just in policies and procedures, it was in the confidence and engagement of the people who made the company run. During his speech that evening, Marcus did something unexpected. He invited Robert, the security guard who had always treated him with respect during his time as a janitor, to join him on stage. Marcus told the story of how Robert had been one of the few people who consistently acknowledged him with kindness during those 8 months, treating a janitor with the same courtesy he showed executives. Marcus announced that Robert was being promoted to head of security, not because of that kindness specifically, but because someone who treated people well regardless of their position was exactly the kind of person who should be leading others. The room erupted in applause, and Robert stood there visibly emotional, shaking Marcus's hand. It was a moment that embodied everything Marcus had learned. That character wasn't about how you treated people who could help you, but how you treated people who seemingly couldn't. Marcus also announced the establishment of the Hayes Foundation for Ethical Leadership, a non-profit organization funded by his personal wealth that would provide grants and training to companies trying to improve their workplace cultures. The foundation would offer scholarships to workers pursuing education, support for whistleblowers facing retaliation, and resources for employees dealing with workplace abuse. Marcus explained that his 8 months as a janitor had opened his eyes to struggles that existed far beyond Hayes Industries, that toxic management and workplace abuse were epidemic problems affecting millions of workers. He had the resources and the platform to make a difference, and he intended to use both. The foundation would also fund an annual award recognizing CEOs and leaders who demonstrated genuine commitment to ethical leadership and employee well-being, judged not by their public statements, but by confidential surveys of their own employees. As the evening concluded, Marcus found himself in a quiet corner of the auditorium, watching his employees celebrate. Jennifer, his assistant, approached and handed him a folder. Inside were letters from employees, hundreds of them, written over the past year. They thanked him for caring enough to see the truth, for taking action when it would have been easier to look away, for proving that leadership could be both strong and compassionate. Some letters were from people who had been directly abused by the terminated managers, expressing relief and gratitude. Others were from employees who had never experienced that abuse directly, but who felt safer and more valued knowing that the company would protect them. One letter, from a young woman who had been on the verge of quitting due to harassment, simply said that Marcus had restored her faith that good people still existed in positions of power. Marcus read through the letters slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with his position. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, isolated in his executive office, relying on reports and metrics to understand his company. He thought about the 8 months he had spent pushing a mop, invisible and exhausted, learning what it truly meant to be powerless in a system designed to protect those at the top. That experience had changed him fundamentally, stripping away the insulation that wealth and position provided, and forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the company he had built. The journey had been humbling, often painful, and absolutely necessary. Marcus kept the janitor's uniform in his office closet, a reminder of those months and the lessons they taught him, Sometimes, late at night when he was alone in his office, he would look at that uniform and remember what it felt like to be Marcus Thompson, the invisible janitor whom Derek Walsh had dismissed without a second thought. He remembered, and he made sure he never forgot, because the moment a leader forgot what it felt like to be powerless was the moment they became dangerous to those they led. Hayes Industries had been broken, but it was healing now, rebuilt on a foundation of respect, accountability, and the understanding that a company was only as strong as the dignity it afforded its most vulnerable members. Marcus had gone undercover to save his company, but in the end the experience had saved him too, transforming him from a distant CEO into a leader who understood that true success wasn't measured in profit margins alone, but in the lives improved and the people empowered along the way. The car in the CEO's parking space remained the same, but the man driving it had become someone entirely different, someone better, someone who had learned that real leadership meant getting your hands dirty, literally and figuratively, in service of something greater than yourself.